Ignition and liftoff of the space shuttle, returning to the space station, paving the way for future missions beyond.
It's interesting. We know a lot about crucifixion, but crucifixion was seen as so disgusting. I believe it was Cicero who said that, like, the word crucifixion shouldn't even be on a Roman man's lips. Wow. I mean, the word excruciating,
right?
X is off of in Latin, and cruce, off the cross.
Oh,
so that's where we get that word, is because this was designed to humiliate, and it was designed to be as painful as possible. There was actually a really good article done by JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which was done by a number of, I think it was in the 70s or the early 80s. It was done by a group of biblical scholars and then medical professionals. And so they looked at the conventions of what we do know about Roman crucifixion, and then they looked at the descriptions in the gospel to try to figure out, okay, if we could diagnose how Jesus died, how would he have died? And so they basically came up with this idea that he probably asphyxiated to death. You kind of drown in your own blood. But the chances of Jesus surviving the crucifixion, I think, are narrow to none. And the chance of him appearing 3 days later completely fine. I mean, if the first thing you do, if you survive a crucifixion and then you go and you find your disciples, the first thing you say is not, peace be with you. It's get me to a hospital, right?
Do they have them back then?
No, not really.
Also, are we entirely certain of their measurement of days?
Greetings, everyone. Greetings. All right. Hope you're doing well. And as promised, we're going to be talking about the Joe Rogan conversation that he had with Wesley Huff. Many of you have already watched it. Some of you have an hour, maybe a few minutes left to go before you finish watching that 3-hour plus interview. And glad you're all here. Yeah, the moment we've been waiting for. Yeah, we all were hoping that Joe Rogan would interview Wesley Huff, and it happened, and it was released, and it was very, very good. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that conversation, folks. In fact, there's a segment of, he says, Rick looking comfy. Yeah, man, it's cold. I don't know, it's cold here in Atlanta. I don't know how it's like in your neck of the woods, Tim, but it's getting kind of frosty out here, chilly out here. So I got to dress for the part, dress for the occasion. But yeah, so we're gonna listen to a couple of segments that I took out of that 3-hour conversation. It was a really good conversation. There's so much in there that we could talk about, but I wanted to laser focus on a couple of areas. We're going to talk about origins, right? There's emphasis on origins, and the emphasis on the crucifixion and the historicity of the Bible. And there are going to be some things I'm going to bring up in regards to the historicity of the Bible, some things we've covered on this channel, specifically in that Canon series that we started at the beginning of the year. Remember that Canon series? In fact, the very last video I did, right, on were the New Testament, were the Christians in the early church adverse to written documents? If you recall what we covered in that live, a lot of that stuff came up in the conversation with Wes Huff and Joe Rogan. All right. So yeah, the weather outside is frightful, right? Let's go ahead and pull that up. Okay. We're going to go ahead and pull it up, and then we're going to watch this segment together. Like I said, it's two parts. I want to focus on about origins, and then I want to focus on the crucifixion and historicity of the scriptures. Okay. So let's focus on that. So here we go. Here we go. Yes, Wes Huff nails interview. Wes Huff nails it. He knocks it out of the park. Okay. And so we're going to start with context here is around origins, and I'll provide some commentary as needed. But I want you, probably not a whole lot of commentary, but commentary as needed. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay. Let's go ahead and listen in.
Yeah. And that even in today, with as much information as we have, you can pick up your phone and ask them, when was Nero born? It'll tell you, like, instantaneously. We still don't have answers to a lot of really fascinating questions, like the Olmecs or all these other civilizations, like who, where did they come from? Why do they look like this? Why'd they make these big stone heads, or Stonehenge? It's another one. Like, gee, what is this?
Yeah.
Like, there's so many versions of that all over the world.
And kudos, shout out to the automatic anti-profanity removal software. So literally yesterday, Christian Doc said, hey, there's a lot of, profanity in this interview, and it sure was. Okay. So I ran it through the filter, and it's doing its job wonderfully, folks. I love this technology. Okay. Just bleeped it right out. Okay. So we're talking about origins. Let's listen in. He's saying, yeah, we got all this technology. We got AI. We're digitally connected, but we're still seeking answers.
And the search for our origins is one of the most human endeavors. One of the most, because to know that we are particularly unique. We're so different. We stand out from every other animal on this planet. And there's this crazy, wild war of biology where life is just eating life all around us. And we just got to some crazy place that far beyond any other creature that's on this planet.
Yeah.
And we did it in a bunch of different ways. We did it in a bunch of different ways all over the place with different scribbles and different icons and different gods and different things. And we're all wondering, like, which one, where did it start? What was the origin of all this? Like, what was the need to write these things down? What purpose did it serve to have these myths and legends and stories? Like, was it just to keep society together, or was it to retell a very important story that was a very unique thing that happened at the dawn of time?
And that's why you see, the literary comparison of ancient Near Eastern origin stories is like a really interesting thing to do, because when you look at something like the Enuma Elish, which was the Babylonian creation story, and then you look at something like Genesis chapter 1, there are obvious crossovers with, like I said before, these ancient Near Eastern conventions. But then you can see that the author of Genesis is making these points that are actually rebutting something like the origin stories of the surrounding cultures that largely believe that matter is like eternal and the gods come out of the created world, and that there's this narrative of the battle that takes place where some gods fight against other gods, and the world around us that we see and like human beings are the end result of this battle. And so they would read this on every Babylonian New Year. And one of the main themes was basically that, like, it's all chance. It's all a random mistake. You were created without purpose and intention because Tiamat gets destroyed. And she is the god that, you know, you come from. And then you read Genesis chapter 1 and it says, in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. And
there it is. So, gotta drop it. There it is. So what that gets missed, kind of going back to the conversation that he had with Billy Carson. This is the same thing he tried to tell Billy Carson, and so many words, was that that Genesis is a refutation of all of these other false accounts of creation. And it's I like what he did. He said, well, you end up with a scenario where there's no purpose at all behind this entity, right? And so you then contrast that with the scriptures where you see there is purpose, true purpose with a true creator, right? And so that often gets missed in a lot of these discussions where people try to make it seem as if Genesis borrowed from these other texts, right? Other literary texts.
he makes it good. And there's this idea that, like, that's countercultural in the idea that the Babylonians did not think that the world was good. And that, like, at the end of every refrain, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, and then it's very good at the end. And that humanity in particular is created in the image of God. Like, that's a very, not just like kings, which a lot of ancient Near Eastern cultures believed that kings were created in the image of God, but that humanity in general is created in the image of God. And this idea of the Imago Dei, that that's why you're different. Like, why are you different from all the animals?
Right.
Because you're given something.
And it's great what Wes said, because if you heard Joe Rogan, he basically, when he was formulating the question, put mankind in the animal kingdom. And now what Wes Huff is doing says, no, mankind, we're not part of the animal kingdom. We're uniquely positioned. There's a whole different thing with human beings. We're made in the image of God. And see, what Wes is doing is saying to all of these people who are always beating the drum and saying all that Genesis is borrowed from all these other stories, is that there's a complete paradigm shift in thinking and motivation behind Genesis versus all of these other literary accounts. There's a whole, because people say, what about the parallels? What about the parallels? You know, earlier in the conversation, I don't have that clip, but that's one of the things that if you watch that, Joe Rogan brought that up a couple of times, was teasing that out. And then Wesley, you know, he responded to it saying, yes, if people focus on the parallels, but people don't focus on the differences. The differences are massive. I mean, you're not focusing essentially on the right thing. I think the analogy he used is the difference between what is it, like aspirin and arsenic or something like that, right? It's like they both begin with the letter A, and you say that's a parallel, but they're radically different in what they do to your body, right? So it's like, you know, we need to understand that. He's bringing some of those details out. These are important and significant details that people that pick against the Christian faith or have axe to grind don't really focus on. And I'm so glad he's bringing that out in this discussion.
That exemplifies a unique quality. And then the ancient Near Eastern cultures that believe that, you know, the planets are gods and that the sea is a god. And then Genesis chapter 1 looks at that, and it kind of subverts the expectations of the day in getting to this ultimate question of, you know, why are we here? What are we supposed to do while we're here? And how do we get out of here? And it says that, no, there's purpose, there's meaning, there's intention. And actually, a lot of the things that you worship, it's pretty stupid because God created them.
Yeah, no, the bleep thing, he said stupid. So the thing, I guess the automatic bleeper is like, well, we don't want the word stupid. We'll bleep that out. But it wasn't anything bad, folks. He just said stupid. But he's making the point, because even the prophet Isaiah, I mean, if you read the prophet Isaiah, remember, the prophet Isaiah in the between the chapters 40 through 48, you know, when you compare the true God, Yahweh, to all the false gods, one of the things it talks about, you know, it recounts people who build their God, carve their God, right? And then take that same piece of wood to warm themselves for fire and take that same piece of wood maybe to cook, and they bow down before it. It's like, this is absolute insanity. I mean, that's the point, right? Is like, you see, even in the scriptures, that same idea is brought out.
There's no like working theory where you can convince me that the whole universe gets compressed into something smaller than the head of a pin and then instantaneously becomes everything that you see.
Well, I think that's why you see natural materialism being woefully inadequate to really explain the ultimate worldview questions that we have.
Just the universe.
Yeah, this is a good point. Natural materialism is not an answer to anything, folks. People punt to say to that gets you nowhere, right? That gets you to absurdity. It doesn't provide any basis for these answers, all right? And I'm so glad he brought that up.
Universe itself, right? Just what we don't know enough. Maybe we one day will. Maybe these, you know, sentient AI systems that we're going to create with quantum computers are going to be able to figure things out in a way that we can't. But at the end of the day, you have one miracle. You have the Big Bang. All of science agrees this happened. That is so much crazier than anything that any religion is proposing, that it's so interesting to me that because we say we have echoes of the Big Bang. There's, you know, radio echoes. Yeah, but also if a miracle did take place, like let's assume that there is actually a higher power that occasionally interacts with human beings. And if a miracle did take place and you were there, you don't have a camera, you don't have a cell phone, you don't have a pen, you can't write things down, maybe you can't even read. And you have this thing that happens to you, and this thing changes the course of human history. This thing changes the direction, that the ideology that these people subscribe to and the moral and ethical structure that they live their life by. It changes untold billions of human beings from that point on.
Yeah.
Pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
That in itself, even if this is just a revelation without a divine interaction, that's a fucking miracle.
Yeah.
It's a miracle that it was created at all.
Oh, no. I'm sorry. It didn't catch it, guys. It didn't catch it. I tried my best. So, hey, maybe better next time, folks. Goodness. You try again. But I think let's pause on this note. Here's the thing. Yeah, she said bleep. Yeah, it missed that one. Oh well, we will move on. It was so fast when he said it. It was quick. He was quick with that one, folks. If he had stretched it out like the other one, it probably would have caught it. So anyway. Yes, mods. We try not to because this is a Christian channel, we try not to have that come through. So forgive me on that one. But I think the thing is what someone said earlier here. Yeah, what caused the quote unquote Big Bang? That's the issue, right? What is the root cause of everything that exists, right? And this is the question, right? I remember that even the late Stephen Hawking was like, well, I have a theory that nullifies even the existence, postulating that God had to start anything. But then what you end up doing is equivocating by basically making nothing into something. So nothing's not really nothing anymore, apparently. And now nothing's actually something. So, you can see the absurdity of these views, because you're just really moving the goalpost and not really addressing the fundamental issue.
Like the whole idea that Christianity, when you're saying that the book of Isaiah?
Yeah.
That the same book is exactly the same as, like, that's a miracle. That's pretty fucking crazy.
Yeah, that is crazy.
You just imagine.
Oh, goodness. All right. Bear with me, folks. So because they talked about the Qumran, they talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a body of work, right? It's a ton of literature. It's a huge find. They talked about that earlier. And what the amazing thing that, remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed is that, remember, you had the Masoretic text. You had the Masoretic text, and at the time of the Masoretic text, essentially the New Testament manuscripts were older than the Masoretic text, right? Right. So then, when you had the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they pretty much confirmed everything in regards to, for example, Isaiah. Let's just use that example. They confirmed that what was written there was word for word what they had already had, which was really fascinating.
Imagine the sheer number of illiterate people, the sheer number of days that have to go by where people are telling the story exactly the same, and that it's entrusted in the hands of these very few people that are so dedicated to it that they get the exact words right 1,000 years later. Pretty bananas.
Well, I mean, that is kind of the crazy thing about Christianity, where you have this Jewish itinerant guy who's walking around first century Roman occupied Judea. He's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself, and then he predicts his own death and resurrection. And then his disciples they think it's over. Like, they're like, he's dead, we're done.
Yeah.
And then they go from 11, scared men, because Judas commits suicide, scared men in an upper room, to completely overhauling the Roman world in only a couple hundred years, because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like, there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
So what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? What do you think happened? Do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
Well, let me pause right there. You hear the question? Joe Rogan asks, do you have a belief, or do you interpret the text and to understand the message? This is a false dichotomy, folks. This is a false dichotomy. Like think about the way as I was listening to this. I don't know if y'all caught this. The way it is, you have your belief over here, then you have the text over here, but our belief is informed by the text. Our belief, I want everybody to hear that loud and clear. Our belief is informed by the text. And this is really important that we understand. He says, I know it hurts the ears, but we all came out of the world. Amen to that, Sheila. Amen to that. Has anyone read the end recently, the end of, towards the end of Romans 4, where it talks about the faith of Abraham? What does it say? And then also in the back of my mind, I'm also thinking John chapter 17 as well. But how does that end? Like, if you look through there, I'm going to just read a few verses real quick to get us thinking about this. What does it say? I'll read verse 14. Well, actually, I'll read verse 13. It says, for the promise, and I'll pull it up so we can see it together on the screen. Yeah, we always we're going to have some Bible scripture here. For those on, this is how we do. If you're a new timer on the channel, we're going to pull up the scriptures. This is how we do it. So show what our faith is based on here. Okay, so we'll go to the text. Ooh, from yesterday. So we go to the text. So this is, notice this is interesting here. It says, for the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if the inheritance of the law who are to be heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. He goes on to say, that is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only the adherents of the law, but also to the one that shares shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all, as it is written, I have made you the father of many nations in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. In hope, he believed against hope that he should become the father of many nations, as he had been told. You know, this is going back to Genesis here. So shall your offspring be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No unbelief made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. And notice what it says here. It says, that is why his faith was counted to him as righteousness. But the words it was counted to him were not written for his sake alone. Focus on this. I'm going to read that verse again. But the words, notice the words. Notice this, what I'm emphasizing here. What's being emphasized in the text? But the words it was counted to him were not written for his sake alone. You see what I'm doing there, what I'm emphasizing? But for ours also. It will be counted to us who believe in him, who it will be counted to us who believe in him who raised from the dead Jesus our Lord, who was delivered up for our trespasses and raised for our justification. Do you see this? This is so important here. When Joe Rogan asked Wes the question, is it based on your belief or is it based on what you have read and your understanding of the meaning of the text? What Joe Rogan failed to understand, that's why I emphasize certain words in the text, is our faith is grounded in the revelation of Scripture. It's grounded in revelation. We can't separate those two, right, from one another, right? And I think that's really important. And then this is the same idea. I'm not going to go there now, but in John 17, remember the high priestly prayer, when Jesus is praying, that he talked about may those believe on their word, right? Their word, right? Well, who's the they? He's talking about the apostles. Their word, I'm sorry, theirs referring to the apostles. They is referring to every believer throughout history, right? But the words are there, right? It's not belief absent of the words. It's belief grounded in the words, right? I think that's really important that we see that and understand that, right? I think that's really, really important, okay? All right, so let's go back. We'll go back to the video. So I hope everyone caught what I just said. I think that was really important. Sometimes when people frame questions, even the question itself is begging the question. So sometimes we need to fix the question before we provide the answer. Okay, let's go back.
Think so. As a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a,
and it is. So our belief is not divorced from reality, right? So the Christian faith isn't, hey, let's believe in a bunch of fairy tales. That's not the Christian faith. It has to be grounded in reality, right? And so I think that's really important, like the historicity of the Christian faith.
guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right. So, but it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024, trying to figure it at the end of 2024, trying to figure this out. literally the end.
Yeah.
Last couple of days. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get
Yeah, and but here's the thing. Here's the funny thing about that question, right? Wasn't it like 5 minutes earlier? Well, it wasn't 5 minutes earlier because that was a previous clip. That when we were talking about the origins, you had Joe Rogan saying, "Man, the beginning of the universe, that had to be like a single miracle or something that started it all, right?" So if you can appeal to that, right, and then not say, well, I'm going to believe that the universe had some type of beginning. Now, typically people don't attribute it to God, unfortunately. But the thing is, what they're talking about is something that defies anything else. We can't really test. You can't appeal to empiricism, where you use like the scientific method and you do observation and experimentation. You can't do that in this case, and yet we believe that there's a fundamental understanding that this occurred, and for most scientists, whether they're believing or unbelieving, they affirm that the steady state model of the universe is a fabrication. There's no steady state model of the universe. That means that the universe is not eternal. There was a starting point of the universe. That's pretty much what everybody, whether you're an unbeliever or a believer, even people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, believes there was a starting point of the universe, right? So what do you do with that? How do you deal with that? And so I think that's important. I think Wes is going to touch on that issue.
Get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on for. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So
how do you fact-check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people.
Well, actually 500, but hey, he's in the conversation. I get it. So that's 1 Corinthians 15.
Saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. I mean, if we read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote these both documents, he says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after he was resurrected from the dead. And so these are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus's ministry, who were there, say at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said. And you go from a bunch of scared guys who, because Jesus wasn't the only messianic figure who arose and claimed to be the Messiah.
Right.
There were a number of individuals both prior to and after Jesus, but they die and the movement dies with them.
Do you think it's possible that he didn't die? And do you think it's possible that they thought he was dead? Because that does happen. There was actually a case
and this is where it's kind of like you hear this all the time, right? What the swoon theory or something like that, where they thought he might have died, but he really wasn't. No. Roman soldiers are good at their job, folks.
Recently, where a guy was about to be harvested for organs. They thought he was dead, and this guy started moving again and came back to life. It's a very, very bizarre case because his family had been told that he was going to be harvested for organs. They were preparing for that. And this guy comes back.
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot about Roman crucifixion. And we know
brutal.
that, and we know that they did their job well.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, if you look at, say, very skeptical biblical scholars, like non-believing atheist, agnostic, Christian scholars, they will say if we can know anything about Jesus, like they'll cast a doubt on a lot of the things that we read about in the Gospels in terms of the actual historical Jesus of Nazareth. They'll say one thing we can be sure of is that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Because we have not just multiple attested documents that we refer to as the New Testament, but Roman and Greek and Jewish writers refer to that claim afterwards and talk about the fact that you have this guy, and it's mocked within earliest Christianity. So one of our earliest, in fact, not one of, the earliest depiction of Jesus on the cross is called the Alexamenos Graphido. And it's probably from the end of the 1st century. And it's it depicts an individual with their arms raised in an act of worship, worshiping a man with a donkey's head who's being crucified. Whoa. And right beside it, it says Alexamenos worships his God in Greek.
And that Alexamenos worship his God is graffiti in the 1st century. That's a lot of graffiti, folks. Graffiti is not something in the modern era. There was graffiti even in the ancient world, and you can find that. You literally can find Alexamenos worship his God. You can find it. You can Google that, pull that image up, and it was mocking followers of Christ right at the very beginning. There was a comment made. I want to address a comment, and I want to thank even the dissenters. Someone came in this comment here. The Uncut Funk. Okay, welcome to Caldwell Apologetics. It says Wes couldn't be more wrong about Isaiah being word for word. So more accurately stated, is probably about 95% accurate, right? So the thing is, if you look at it, there's not going to be any teaching or anything like that that's different between what you see in the Dead Sea Scroll and what you see from the Masoretic text. And so there are always going to be what are called textual variants. We covered this before, but most of the textual variants that you find have literally no bearing on the meaning of the text, right? So in essence, he's right when he said, as far as any meaning or anything like that changing, he would be 100% correct about that. Uncut Funk. All right. So glad you're here. Keep watching if you're willing. All right. So let's keep going.
Whoa.
And it's mocking, right? Because crucifixion was for the lowest of the low. It was for like slaves. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen, you were banned from being crucified.
Who was it that got crucified upside down?
Peter.
Why? Was it because like regular crucifixion wasn't good enough for him? Or what was he didn't deserve it because Christ had gone through it?
Well, so the story is that they say, we're going to crucify you. And he says, it's like too big of an honor to die like my Lord. And they say, well, we can fix that.
Oh, Jesus. Shut your mouth, buddy.
Listen, the Romans were pretty brutal.
Oh, yeah.
But this is why we know, it's interesting. We know a lot about crucifixion, but crucifixion was seen as so disgusting. I believe it was Cicero who said that the word crucifixion shouldn't even be on a Roman man's lips. Wow. The word excruciating,
right.
X is off of in Latin, and crus, off the cross.
Oh,
so that's where we get that word, is because this was designed to humiliate, and it was designed to be as painful as possible. There was actually a really good article done by JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which was done by a number of, I think it was in the 70s or the early 80s. It was done by a group of biblical scholars and then medical professionals. And so they looked at the conventions of what we do know about Roman crucifixion, and then they looked at the descriptions in the gospel to try to figure out, okay, if we could diagnose how Jesus died, how would he have died? And so they basically came up with this idea that he probably asphyxiated to death. You kind of drown in your own blood. But the chances of Jesus surviving the crucifixion, I think, are narrow to none. And the chance of him appearing 3 days later completely fine. If the first thing you do, if you survive a crucifixion and then you go and you find your disciples, the first thing you say is not, peace be with you. It's
right.
Get me to a hospital, right?
Do they have them back then?
No, not really.
Are we entirely certain of their measurement of days?
Let me talk about a little of this. Glad you're here, Faith Refined by Fire. You're always bringing some interesting comments. Yeah, that was interesting bit of information about the word excruciating. Yeah, that's one thing I've learned. I learned about that a few years ago myself, which I find interesting. But I think the point that Wes is making that can't be, we got to make sure we're following that, is that crucifixion was designed for you, the end result for you to be dead. Not to walk away from a crucifixion. So I think he's making some really good points here, because you hear all these theories like, well, Jesus was crucified, but he survived the crucifixion. I mean, some people like the swoon theory idea, which was related to the question that Joe Rogan just asked a moment ago.
So this is an interesting question because of the differences between when
and this question about the dates is often used as say, see, the Gospels have contradictions, y'all. Don't y'all know, Christians, the Gospels have contradictions. So he's going to explain why the dates, right? 3 days, is it, how's that being calculated here? Is it different in John? Is it different? What's going on here? He's going to explain the differences.
When the Gospel of John says Jesus died compared to the Synoptics, because John appears to be using the Roman convention of counting time, and the other Gospels, when they describe the timing, appear to be using the Jewish ones. And actually, if you correlate between the two, they match up pretty well. So the thing is, with Jews, any part of a day was considered a day. So 3 days and 3 nights becomes almost an idiom for any part of that day is the day. So if Jesus, and because they count evening to morning is the day, it's very possible that it wasn't like how we would think of 3 24-hour days, especially if he dies on Friday and wakes up on Sunday.
So that would actually make it less time than more time.
Yeah.
It's not like he had recovery time.
Oh, no, he didn't have recovery
That's
time.
what I'm saying. That's what I'm kind of getting.
Recovery time. But I mean, even if you think about the book of Esther, I mean, you see that same dynamic of 3 days, right? When any part of the day is considered a whole day, right? So you see, like, if you read through the book of Esther, I think it's chapter 5 in the book of Esther, you see that language there, I believe, in Esther, one example, even from the Old Testament.
Yeah. And it's not like it was 3 days, it was actually 3 months.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No, not like that.
Then 400 people saw him afterwards.
That's the claim that Paul makes.
Paul makes this claim.
Yeah.
And somebody, please, I don't want to see 100 videos. He said 400 people, it's 500 people. He lied. If this is the kind of the pushback that I hear and see, that's going to be ridiculous. But people would literally nitpick on any little thing that Wes Huff says now. People are just creating all kinds of, like, instead of dealing with the substance of his argument, okay, yeah, he flubbed and left out 100 people. But we could all do that, even on our best days.
Yeah.
And how many different people have some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection?
Well, you have Peter, Paul, Jude, James, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The thing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Matthew and John are attributed to direct disciples of Jesus. Luke and Mark are not. So they are not eyewitnesses within the Jesus community. In fact, Luke prefaces his gospel by saying that. He's right up front about this. He's like, hey, I'm not an eyewitness. Don't confuse me with an eyewitness. But he actually uses conventional writing. What's the term I'm looking for? He uses writing conventions of the day that would fit within regular biography that was written within the Roman world. So you have a guy named Quintilian who is basically, I mentioned him before with the, he's teaching people how to write. And he says that if you're going to write biography, you need to be interviewing eyewitnesses and you can't be too far away from the event to be able to write these things. And Quintilian, Lucian, and Josephus, who are all these very prominent ancient biographers and writers of history, have a lot of crossover in the way they describe how you should write history with the words that Luke uses at the beginning of his gospel, where he says, I'm interviewing eyewitnesses and I'm writing up an orderly account. And so he's saying, I'm going to use these methods that are expected as good history of my day. I'm not an eyewitness, so I'm going to try to find the people who are eyewitnesses, and I'm going to try to encapsulate this within a document that communicates what is being written.
So we have an account of the resurrection. Do we have an account of the denial of the resurrection? Is there an historical record of him just dying and this, like a refutal or a rebuttal rather to what they're saying?
No, the only ones from the ancient world that deny his resurrection are groups that come on afterwards that sometimes are described as Gnostics, and they're not necessarily just denying it for the reasons we might think they were. They're denying it because they have incorporated ideas of pagan philosophy where they believe that the spiritual is good and the physical is bad.
So he's talking about the dualism. So you see even some of the proto-Gnostic ideas that probably were being addressed even in like 1 John, right? Think about 1 John chapter 4, where you have that, where it says anyone essentially that believes that that Jesus did not come into the flesh is of the Antichrist, right? I'm just paraphrasing that section, but that's in 1 John chapter 4. What's going on there, right? Wouldn't the denial be that Jesus, the denial would be the deity of Christ? No, the denial is that Jesus did not have a real body. And so this is what Wes Huff is talking about. So you had Docetism, that's the proto-Gnostic idea there, where you basically have this dualistic idea. Everything in the physical realm is corrupt. Everything in the spiritual realm is good and pure. And so you had these kind of proto-Gnostic ideas coming around, but you notice this is coming later. This is not primitive Christianity. It's not the view. Unlike sometimes people like Bart Ehrman and others try to float that idea like there were these multiple ideas of Christianity that what people were holding on to. No, these ideas came later and started to creep in, right?
So if Jesus was crucified, let me back up. If Jesus is God, he cannot have a physical body. So they deny that he actually had a physicality to him. This is sometimes called Docetism, because dokein in Greek means to seem. So these groups that we describe as the Docetics, they are denying that Jesus had a physical body. He only seemed to have a physical body. And they wrote documents later on. So the Gospel of Peter, which comes around in 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, is being written, and it has Jesus kind of chilling on the cross because he's not really physical, because he's divine, and physical entities don't have physical bodies.
And this is why, people say, why aren't these books part of the New Testament canon? Because Jesus wasn't chilling on the cross, folks.
Flag on the play.
Jesus wasn't chilling on the cross. He wasn't just sitting back and just, hey, because I don't really have a body here. I don't really have a physical body. Nope. So
we don't actually get like a concrete denial of his resurrection in that way until you get things like the Gospel of Barnabas in the Middle Ages.
Wait a minute.
It's actually the
Faith Refined by Fire. He's going to be on PBD. He's going to be on Valuetainment's platform. Really? Where did you hear that? Where's the news? Is that something you're speculating, or did someone drop something online with this? Because that would be awesome. He needs to go to every single platform that Billy Carson was on to refute all of that nonsense. Really. And what I find interesting, did anybody find, I don't know, because I didn't watch all of the Billy Carson conversation with Joe Rogan, but I noticed during this whole conversation, like 3 hours long, there were moments where either Joe Rogan or Wesley asked someone, hey, can you pull this up? Can you pull this up on the web browser? Can you pull this up on the internet? Pull up this document, pull up this image, pull up this thing. Did anybody recall if any of that happened? I don't want to misspeak about the interview with Billy Carson if they in fact did do that. But I noticed there was a lot of emphasis on that during this conversation. Can you pull these things up so we can see it on the screen? So I don't know. Maybe someone can share in the chat whether or not that happened.
Document that Billy brought up to me in the conversation we had is the evidence that Jesus was never crucified, the Gospel of Barnabas. Well, Gospel of Barnabas is 15th century. It paraphrases Dante's Inferno. It's not an ancient document.
Yeah, that 15th century document. No, it's not ancient. Very modern document, actually.
So, but in the ancient world, nobody really had that big of a problem with these kind of supernatural claims. The more of the kind of skepticism was why you would worship a crucified individual to begin with.
Wow. So they were less surprised that he was resurrected. Or
and I would even say if you read 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where it says that Greeks are seeking wisdom and the Jews seek a sign, focusing on the Greeks, I think that hits when the Apostle Paul is talking about that, I believe around verse 18 in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. That's the issue. It's like, man, this Christian faith is crazy. I mean, it's wild compared to us. Remember how the Epicureans and the Stoics commented on the Apostle Paul when he had an encounter with them at the Areopagus on Mars Hill in Athens, Greece. He's a babbler of strange doctrines, strange teachings. Remember when he talked about Christ and the resurrection, right? It's like, oh man, this is a babbler of strange doctrines. You see what I mean? And I think this is what Wesley Huff is highlighting here. The mindset, they weren't anti-supernatural. They were anti-Christian worldview. That's the issue, folks.
That you would worship a crucified like teacher was just seen as silly.
Because it's so humiliating to be crucified.
Yeah. And that like a God would let himself go through this.
Right.
Like what are you talking about? In fact, the ancient world didn't really have a problem with supernatural events. There is an ancient writer who mocks Christianity, and he particularly mocks Christianity in saying that, of course, Jesus did miracles because Jesus had a childhood in Egypt. And he goes, all of those Egyptians are magicians anyways. So he just learned the magic when he was a child. So he...
Sounds like something that Billy Carson might have said. He learned all the magic in Egypt. When he went to Egypt is when Jesus learned all those tricks, right? You hear that, right? It's the untold stories of Jesus' youth when he gained secret knowledge, mystical knowledge, and he kind of twisted that knowledge around for his own agenda.
He actually confirms, incidentally, two things: that the narrative in the Gospels where it says that the Holy Family fled to Egypt during the reign of Herod, he corroborates that he actually thinks that happened. And that Jesus did miracles. He just attributes the miracles to Jesus being a traveling magician anyways. And
yeah, it's funny because even in ancient literature, some of the best things that help our case are even critics of the Christian faith because they end up corroborating details of history that we all affirm in the scriptures.
Anybody who lived in Egypt knows some magic.
That is what's really fascinating, that the mindset of the people that lived back then was that whatever was going on in Egypt was so crazy that they had to be magicians.
Yeah, but everybody believed in supernatural events. Like there's no such thing as like a secular work in the ancient world. Even Plutarch, who's one of the most famous biographers in the ancient world, he wrote 90 biographies, of which 60 still survive today. He was a priest of Apollo. So like he's already assuming that the gods exist, that crazy things are going to happen in the world. And so they didn't have a problem with people doing miracles or crazy things happening. Well,
that's also why it's so interesting trying to put your mind into the context of people that lived back then when you try to interpret what these stories were all about. because they did believe in things that weren't real. So when they talk about this thing that we're supposed to believe is real, when you have all this evidence that they believe things that aren't true,
Yeah.
it's interesting, right? Because like you're now saying, yeah, but this one really was true.
Right.
Well, there's so many different things that they thought of and believed that weren't true.
Yeah. So this historiographically is, so when we do history, it's an inference to the back.
Before, he's going to do a brilliant job breaking this down. But last night, remember how I read, I think it was 4 verses, and the 4 verses were the distinction between truth and myth and truth. Remember? So if you didn't watch the live last night, or you're new here and like, what is this guy talking about? The video I did yesterday when I did my review of Dr. William Lane Craig, and I had another content creator reach out to me about Craig. He said, "Man, Rick, you should have invited me on, because I went to Talbot and I could have given you some more insight, because I have some problems with Craig as well. So maybe we'll do a part 2 on that and bring him on." And by the way, that's in case you don't know, that's the Christian Road Warrior. Many of you know who that is. Christian Road Warrior. He reached out to me on that. So we might do a part 2 on that. But anyway, remember those verses that I gave you. And the point is that the apostles knew the difference between a myth and the truth. They weren't doing some type of mytho-historical view of things. They put myth over in this one corner and said, this is not what we're teaching. This is not what we're promoting. We know about the existence of myths, but what we're doing is a complete counter to myths. It's the truth. And even when in the pastoral epistles, for example, we talked about last night, the instruction that Paul gave to Timothy was the distinction between false teachers and what you're tasked to do is you're teaching truth versus myths, right? So I think that's really important that distinction was never blurred with the apostles in the New Testament.
Best explanation. And so there are probabilities of things that have happened in history where we can say, okay, there's a higher probability of event A happening and a lower probability of event B happening. So the example I often give is like Jonah being swallowed by the fish. Like that's low probabilistically, not that it didn't happen, but that like as a historian, we got to like say, well, there's no independent cross-reference sources. You don't have multiple attestation for this particular event. The interesting thing about Jesus is that we have more evidence from different writings in the ancient world than we probably should have for someone of his stature. Because we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, these 4 biographies. There's really only one other person in and around that time that can claim to have that much kind of independent testimony of their.
So he says you have to shut down for about 3 minutes. Why? You got shut down. Oh, say you got shut down for about 3 minutes. Really? He says you're going to get a strike. No! Don't say that. Don't say that, folks. What's happening? Says I think you need to pause more. All right, I'm trying. I was trying not to. Let's keep going. Said YouTube will escalate if it doesn't figure it out. I blame Tim. All right, I'll try to pause a little bit more. We're getting through it. Need a plan B.
Life, and it's the Roman Emperor Tiberius. So he also has 4 biographers. He has Cassio Dio, Suetonius, Tacitus, and.
Let me see something here. Let me see something here. YouTube. Stream suspended. Policy violation. Man, this is crazy. All right. So I'm going to pull it up again. You can't do commentary? All right. It seems like I'm back. I'm back, y'all. All right. Yeah, I'm still here. You hear me? Press 1. Yay. Press 1. Put 1 in the chat if you can hear me. Put 1 in the chat if you can hear me. Okay. Yes, sir. Okay. So we gotta play the game, folks. We gotta play the game. Goodness, this is not the first time this happened on this channel. All right, we're back. So here's what we gotta do. I gotta talk, and I'm not ashamed to talk. We're about almost done. We got like maybe 15 minutes. So I'll make comment. I'll talk and pause between their conversation and try to get through this. Okay, great. Let's keep going.
And Velius Paterculus. And so the Roman emperor, who's the most famous, most powerful person at the time, has a similar amount of historiographical evidence biographically for his, the events of his lifetime that Jesus does.
What is the interpretation of Jesus from non-Jesus followers at the time?
And this is a good question. What's the interpretation of Jesus from non-Jesus followers, right? And watch how this is how I'm going to game the system. I'm just going to like repeat the question. All right, how about that?
What did they think he was or who he was?
He was a crucified traveling rabbi.
That's
I mean, you have individuals like Josephus mentions him, end of 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century.
And we know that Josephus wasn't a believer, right? Right. So I'm glad he mentioned Josephus.
He was a Jewish Roman writer. Tacitus mentions him, who also wrote about the emperor. And you have a number of these individuals, Cassio or Suetonius, but what they're doing mostly is describing what the followers of Christianity are saying about him. So you do have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt in that they're not saying things that they believe happened. They're talking about things that Christians believe happened. And Christians are this very unusual group because they're monotheistic in a world that does not believe in monotheism. And Jews are monotheistic in that time as well. But there was this idea that your religion could be tied to your ethnicity, and that was okay. Like the Jews believe in one God, and that's weird, but they're Jews. Whereas the Christians start to convert people who are of all different ethnic backgrounds. And so they're like, well, what the heck is going on here?
So what is he talking about? This idea of henotheism, where you had each nation or each ethnicity would have their own national god. And then you have this odd thing that's happening with Christianity, right? Where you had people of multiple nations coming to Christ. And I mean, think about even what Paul says in Romans. He says, is God of the Jews only? No, also God of the Gentiles, right? You see what I mean? It's like this is a complete unique thing that's happening here in the ancient world.
Because why are you saying so? The earliest criticisms of Christianity were actually that it was atheistic, being the negative participle, and theos meaning God, right? Because the ancient world was polytheistic,
right?
But more than that, it was what's sometimes referred to as henotheism.
There we go.
In that it's not that they believe in many.
I feel like me and Wes, we brothers from another mother. Throwing out the same words. I haven't even heard. When I was jumping around this, I haven't bits and pieces of this I listened to, but some of it I didn't. So I'm glad we're on the same page here. One thing I did catch, I don't know if y'all caught this about Wes, when he talked about the historicity of Jonah. Did anybody catch that? And this is not me trying to poke at Wes, but I did make an observation about that because I do know when it comes to a lot of the historical criticism, at least the popular historical criticism, when you start looking at some of the events in the Old Testament, they can kind of take it or leave it, right? And so I'm not trying to say what bus he's on. I'm just saying that He said something. Maybe we'll revisit later. I'm not sure. I don't know if you caught it. Right.
Gods. It's that they believe in many gods, and your gods could be my gods, right? Jupiter could be Zeus, just the same god by a different name. And your cities could have gods, right? Osiris and Ra can live in Egypt, and Zeus and Athena can live here, and that doesn't compromise anything. But then the Christians are coming around and they're saying, actually, no, none of those gods exist. If they exist, then they're demons, but they don't actually exist. And this was a big point of persecution within early Christianity, is that a lot of physical events were tied to supernatural events. So there's an ancient historian who has this line where he says, if the Nile River is too high in Egypt or the Tiber River is too low in Rome, the cry will ring out, the Christians to the lions. Because if you have a famine in Athens, and they're going, okay, what's the reason for the famine?
Stop. You guys did it again. Oh my goodness. All right, let's see. Come on. Just let the stream go through. They hit me again. They hit me again. I'm going to see. I'm going to wait. I am going to wait a minute. If it doesn't come back, then we'll I'll create another stream. So you should speed up the video. All right, I'm going to start another stream. All right, I'm back. I'm back. I'm back. All right. You hear me? Put a 1 in the chat. Put a 1 in the chat if I'm back. 1 in the chat. 1 in the chat if I'm back. This is a fast. And I'm gonna set the playback speed to 1.5. I know Sheila doesn't like it because her ears work a little differently. I'm just playing with Sheila. All right. We're back, folks. You can't keep a good apologist down. How about that? All right, let's keep going, all right? Let's keep going.
Well, Athena's mad because there's a bunch of people running around saying she doesn't exist. Okay, well, let's deal with them. Let's
to the lions.
Yeah, let's get rid of them, and that'll solve our issue. Wow. So Christians were this very oddball group.
Kind of crazy that it wound up taking over the area.
Well, that's part of, I think, the argument of, well, how do you explain that? How do you explain it going from 11 scared disciples in an upper room to being willing to go out and die for the proclamation that you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and you saw him, and you touched him, and you ate with him, and he wasn't a ghost. You actually ate fish with the resurrected Jesus.
How does Constantine fit into this? Like, what is Constantine's education in Christianity?
There we go. Everybody's always got to bring up Constantine. You can't have a conversation about this topic unless Constantine or the Council of Nicaea comes up. You may not want to even bring up Constantine. You may not even want to bring up Council of Nicaea, but it never fails, folks. Someone's got to drop Constantine, right?
Christianity.
Yeah, so Constantine is a pagan up until a point in time when he converts. So
who educates him?
Good question. I don't know in terms of his education. I know he does have some like crossover with some prominent Christians later on. He's a sun worshiper, but
All right. He's a sun worshiper. All right. See, he's a sun worshiper. That's how you guys start to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Is that sun worship stuff? Is that okay? I mean, I'm just, I've heard it all, folks.
right before Constantine, you had a guy named Diocletian, who was the emperor, who basically had the goal of wiping out Christianity entirely. And so
That's right. You guys got to understand. I mean, Christianity wasn't like, hey, guys, we were so glad you're here in the Roman Empire, right? No, I mean, you have people like Diocletian and others that were trying to stamp out Christians. I mean, even during the time of the writing of First Peter, what was the context behind that? Nero, who would take Christians and then use them as torches for his garden parties. This is the warm reception Christians were getting in the Roman Empire, folks.
So the worst point of persecution was under the Diocletian rule. He actually made it so that if you had to go into like the equivalent of your town hall, and you had to take a pinch of incense and offer it onto the altar of Caesar, him, right, the king, and say, Caesar Kurios, Caesar is Lord. And part of this was that they knew that Christians say, Jesus Kurios, Jesus is Lord. And Christians wouldn't do that. So here's how you...
Yeah, so there's significance in that term, kurios, right? Because to say that Jesus, and I'm trying to work with this system, folks, so bear with me. To say that Jesus is Lord is talking about his divinity, folks. This is what a lot of people who deny the deity of Christ don't understand, the New Testament use of the Greek word kurios. It's not saying sir or some master or something. It's applying deity to Christ, because here's the thing, and I think who has done a great job on this, Anthony Rogers. Many of you know who Anthony Rogers is. He does a wonderful job. He mentioned this, and this you can check this out for yourselves. About 75% of the Yahweh references in the New Testament are attributed to Jesus. So Yahweh, you have the Tetragrammaton in the Old Testament, and the New Testament is being applied to who? A lot of people think to the Father. No, the majority of the attributions are to Christ. For example, like Joel, right? Joel chapter 2. You have the Tetragrammaton right there. Who is it attributed to in the New Testament? Jesus. And you see those examples over and over again. You see that in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, referencing back to the prophet Isaiah. Who's that referring to in Isaiah? Yahweh. Who's it referring to in the New Testament? Jesus. And you see this over and over and over and over again.
outed them. Oh, and if you didn't do this, so if you did do it, you were given this piece of paper. It's called a libellus. And a libellus allowed you to buy and sell. If you didn't do it, you didn't get a libellus, which meant that you were not allowed to buy and sell. Wow. And so you have this incredible era of persecution where Christians are being like killed, and Christian literature in particular is being destroyed because they're hunting it out. So Constantine comes after this, and he knows that this is bad for Roman society. And so him and Licinius get together. They're both ruling the Roman Empire at the time. And in 313, they put out this edict of tolerance, which includes Christianity. So it's called the Edict of Milan, and it decriminalizes Christianity. So it's no longer illegal to be a Christian.
What was their motivation?
I think they just felt like in order to establish peace within the empire, you need to make sure that people aren't fearing you constantly to that degree. And so...
And behind that, I don't know if this was Joe Rogan's motivation, but a lot of times when you hear Constantine involved, it's a tool of control, right? Isn't that the narrative you hear? Well, see, what happened is, Constantine showed up, and now we're going to use religion as a tool to control the masses. Sometimes that behind what's the motivation? What's the motivation question, right? Because that's what you hear, right? You go and read all these kind of backwards blogs and all these prognosticators, and they're saying that left and right all the time.
Well, it wasn't just Christianity that benefited from the Edict of Milan. A number of religious minority groups were benefited from this particular event. But this happens between 313 and 325. Constantine converts, And so he becomes friendly to Christians. He also, he commissions books of the Bible to be written. And so this is where we first get our understanding. Like when we think of a Bible.
And let me say this, Constantine did not create the New Testament canon. This is another thing that we need that gets thrown into Council of Nicaea. See, that's when they decided the canon of the Bible. That's not. This is why if you are in doubt, if you just don't understand, or you need an understanding, we're doing the canon series mods. One of the mods brought that in earlier. In fact, I got the link. Where is that link? Right here on the screen. This is it, to the canon series, right? So we have a playlist on the channel to the New Testament canon series. We talk about these issues. Well, we covered a lot of issues. There's going to be more things that we're going to cover. We just finished talking about whether or not the early church was had aversion to written documents, right? That's a really good one you need to check out. The next one we're going to do is talk about the Apostle Paul, because some people try to make Paul say, well, Paul, he was against written documents. No, he wasn't, folks. And so we're going to deal with that. That's going to be the next one coming up. So if you want more on New Testament canon, we're going to be covering that very soon, okay? All right.
We think of it as like in a single bound volume. Like, because we have the 66 books of the Bible, and has a nice cover on the page or on the front. But in the ancient world, those existed independently. So like P52, like that would be a separate copy of the Gospel of John, and that's what would have been understood as scripture. Well, Constantine, as like a peace offering, commissions all of these documents to be brought together and published in one book. And so we actually have what we think are some of these documents. So when I was talking with Billy Carson, he brought up the Sinai Bible, Codex Sinai.
And here's the thing that needs to be understood. The canon, right? We talked about that, is that we don't hold to this. We shouldn't really hold. Let's put it this way: to kind of this extrinsic view of the canon, where you had some type of external body imposing the canon on Christians. That's not what we see happening historically. Remember, we've been looking at this historically, and so the church recognized the Bible, right? The books of the Bible, but they did not make those books canon, right? That's the thing. And I think the issue fundamentally for a lot of people is your definition of canon. If your definition of canon is some organization that got together and then they like, hey, these books are in and these books are out, then your idea of canon will move to maybe the late 3rd, 4th century. The things that we have been talking about on this channel is that at the very inception of the church, you actually had canon from the very inception, right? Starting obviously with the Old Testament scriptures that were already there, plus the books of the New Testament that were all brought to bear by the end of the 1st century, okay?
Sinaiticus. Codex Sinaiticus is probably one of these documents that Constantine commissioned, because it's one of our earliest examples of a cover-to-cover, Genesis to Revelation copy of the Bible. And it comes from the 4th century. And based on both its dating and based on the fact that this would have been incredibly expensive to make. Like, it took 360 sheep just to put together, which would have been the equivalent of, like, I don't know, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars today. So the reason why we're pretty sure that documents like Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, potentially even Codex Alexandrinus or Codex Washingtonianus are documents that could have been part of this commissioning is just because they're such giant projects. Very few people would have had the ability to produce something like this other than an emperor. And so we actually have some of these documents that survive today.
Are there any books that were decided, and how do they pick the order that these stories are in the Bible? And are there any books that were excluded,
Yes.
where there's debate on it?
Yeah, great question. So this is the issue of what's sometimes called the canon of Scripture.
Right.
So very early on, when you have Christians having these conversations.
Great topic, by the way. If you're interested in this topic, once again, we cover this every week. We probably won't cover canon this week, but definitely next week we'll pick up probably part 5 of our canon series.
The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's unanimous agreement about those. Particularly, and that's not to say that there aren't other Gospels that pop up. It's that you have this chain of custody that goes back to the earliest Jesus community. Jesus has disciples, and there's a group of individuals who we call the Apostolic Fathers, who are the disciples of Jesus' disciples. And so they comment on the books that the disciples of Jesus, or that people within the community of the disciples of Jesus wrote. And so we actually have a very close connection to the time. And we see early on that you have guys like Ignatius of Antioch, arguing that there are only 4 Gospels. He's in the 2nd century, and there couldn't be any more than 4. Or Theophilus of Antioch makes the similar argument, and they name Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, Ignatius of Antioch also talks about other Gospels, but he specifically highlights the fact that the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of, these ones that we kind of hear about, Mary, Judas, that the reason we know that they're not associated with the names that are attached to them is because they're being written in times when those people were dead, and they have these rings of pagan philosophy that are incorporated into them, which is completely foreign to 1st century.
Yeah, things like Gnosticism and all kinds of other things, right? I mean, he's bringing up this point. It's like you always hear people say, what about these missing books of the Bible? So that's begging the question, right? When you hear people say, where are the missing books? They're presupposing that these books were part of the canon. You understand? And then you also have this view, which is a very sad view, it's crazy view, like why is there even a canon to begin with, right? This is why that last live I did on canon is so important, because you even have people, some of the scholars who are saying, look, even the idea of having a canon for the church is ridiculous. They don't even believe that should even be a thing. And it opens you up to all kinds of ideas, right? If you don't believe that there's a canon, right, there's an authoritative revelation, then what happens? You kind of open the door to anything. Especially a lot of these guys in that view are focusing on this idea that true religion is experiential, and the written word makes religion cold or something like that, right? You see, and so think about even in modern evangelicalism. Let's just even take our modern context, how people want to like over spiritualize, which I think is kind of not really any form of spiritual thought at all, by saying, well, you're being intellectual, you're not being spiritual when you want sound exegesis of the scriptures, when you want clear exposition of the text. Oh, you're not allowing the Holy Spirit to use you, Mr. Caldwell or Mr. Perry, Derek. You're not allowing the Spirit to use you because you're focusing on the meaning of words. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. You see what I mean? That which they're taking 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and completely abusing the meaning of those words that Paul's saying, right? Ripping them out of their context to kind of promote this idea that, you can't put God in a box. We got to think outside the box. God's still speaking. All of these ideas, folks, are coming from someplace. And it's true of every one of those ideas, they have a low view of Scripture. The Scripture is too restrictive for them. They need freedom to flex their quote unquote spiritual muscles, right? And so understand the implications of some of these views. All right, I'll keep going. My time's up. Let's keep going.
Judaism. So Jesus would not have, so in the Gospel of James, Jesus is worshiping a goddess named Sophia. It's like, okay, well, no first century Jew is going to do that. That's obviously paganism. And so we have these early conversations. But when Christians are thinking about, well, what is and isn't Scripture, the earliest Christians are Jews who believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And the Jews had this idea that the promises of God are followed up by the writings, the documents that establish those. So the word that's often used is covenant, right? God.
Ooh, that's right. Doesn't it sound familiar, y'all? If y'all, man, I love this part. The reason why I took this whole clip, this whole conversation, a lot of good things were brought up. This is exactly what we talked about in our conversation on the canon. What did we talk about? That the Jewish community, which were the earliest Christians, right, the early followers of Christ, they anticipated the completion of the story from the Old Testament, right? We covered this in the playlist. If you haven't watched the video, got to watch the video because we talked about this at length. And this is what Wes is talking about right now. There was an anticipation. And this is why even the introduction of the Gospels are a continuation of where the Old Testament, that 400 year, that intertestamental period, 400 years of silence, right? Pick and continue the story, right? Think about how the beginning, Mark, for example, Mark chapter 1. Think about how Mark chapter 1 begins. We covered this already during that live.
God makes a covenant with people, and that's always followed up by written text. So this is why sometimes, well, in the case of Moses, it's literally inscribed on a tablet, right? And in the prophets, sometimes you get this command, write this on a scroll and inscribe this on a tablet. And
man, Wes is making me smile. He's making me smile, y'all. He said, remember we talked about what was there a precedent? Was there some precedents that exist about writing things down? He talked about the very things we brought up about even in the Old Testament as it relates to the covenant. When there was a giving of the covenant, there was the writing down. When there was giving of new revelation, rather, right? Connected to God's redemption of a people. Remember how even Exodus chapter 20 begins. I am the God that brought you out of the land of Egypt, right? And then you have the Decalogue to follow, the giving of the revelation. And then after that, the command to write these things down over and over. This is the same community at the very advent of the church. So that this whole idea of writing things down wasn't some new thing that just popped out of nowhere, right? This was connected to the history of this people. Wow.
Jewish scriptures in Jesus' day were seen as a story in search of a conclusion, because they were looking for this figure, this Mashiach, the Messiah, who would come and fulfill things like the reign of David. So they're talking about these things. They're actually expecting them to happen. And so the story in search of a conclusion.
You see that? They are expecting there was expectation. There need to be a conclusion. We're not at the end of the story. We got more chapters to this story, and there's an anticipation of that. And the way the New Testament authors, their introduction, and this is another thing too. I don't know, Susie Q, you working in overdrive. I appreciate you, sister. This is a wonderful mod here. She's in overdrive. Also Tim as well. I need to put a play. I don't even know how I have the playlist. I do have a playlist. New Testament use of the old. If you can share that playlist as well, because one of the things that Wes is bringing up right now, I think is really important, is that the prophetic, use that word prophetic in the biblical sense, not in some other ways people try to use it, but the prophetic revelation we see in the Old Testament, the same mindset, the same idea of the prophetic is what you see the apostles in that same vein, continuing the story that started in the Old Testament scriptures. And this is why, hermeneutics is also important as well, because a lot of what Wes is doing here, we want to dig deeper in this, is things we've covered on various lives. We talked about New Testament use of the old. What playlist? Oh, New Testament use of the old. I think I have a playlist for New Testament use of the old. How did the New Testament authors use the content of the Old Testament scriptures? And we've had various lives and various examples about that. If that's something you're interested in, help me out, sister. Help me out. I believe there's a playlist. There it is. There it is. He beat you. He beat you, Susie. He beat you. All right. You got to be a little quicker because we got Tim's right on your heels. All right. Let's keep going.
In the Christian understanding is that Jesus is that individual. He comes and he does things like he says at the Last Supper right before his crucifixion, that he's establishing a new covenant in his blood. And so the earliest Christians, mostly who are Jews, who believe in Jesus as the Messiah, they see, okay, there's a new covenant, which is actually promised in Jeremiah 31:31, when God says that he's going to make a new covenant and inscribe the law in people's hearts. That covenant has come, okay, the promises have come. So the earliest Christians very organically say, okay, where's the writing? Because we expect this to happen. Promises are followed up by writings. And so they start to have these conversations of what are the writings and where can we find them? And so very early on, because the New Testament has 27 books in it, very early on, 24 of the 27 are unanimously accepted. So by the time you get to the middle of the 2nd century, we have lists in documents like there's a document called a Muratorium Fragment, which there's debate on its dating, but it's probably like mid to late 2nd century, and it includes 24 of the 27. And it gives reasoning why. Now, the other books that are in our New Testament that aren't in that 24, are ones that were discussed because the earliest Christians were trying to figure out, okay, can we tie this to either an apostle or someone who knew an apostle? Because we have a lot of books flying around with the names of John and Peter on them. So you have the
All right. So what Billy, oh, not Billy, Wes, because I was thinking of Billy, okay, because I was thinking of the conversation that Wes had with Billy. Remember when in that debate / discussion / conversation, however you want to bring it up, he used the word verisimilitude. Remember that nice word? I love the way it sounds. Verisimilitude, right? Remember he asked Billy, do you understand? Do you know what that means? This is what he's talking about right here, folks. He's like, there are features of the books that are similar, right? Written by an apostle, right? There's certain things about these things that have to correspond. And that's true because the thing is, fundamentally, one of the things that we recognize as a Bible student, a student of the Bible, is that there's a consistent revelation in the Bible. You don't see, going from the Old Testament to the New, the apostles, or even in the Old Testament, how one prophet uses another prophet, them doing some radical new things. Like, oh, we're going to do something new here. This is a new day. No, none of that's going on, folks. None of that, you see none of that there. And so, like the idea of Jesus chilling on the cross, just chilling like a villain on the cross. No. That's not right and exact. There's something wrong here, folks, with this text.
Of Peter, and you have the revelation of Peter, and you have the Gospels of Peter, and you have, so how do we do our due diligence to try to tie this back? So there's 2 letters of Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter in the New Testament. And the early Christians are like, we got to make sure we can tie these to Peter. Or the book of Jude and the book of James, which are ascribed to the brothers of Jesus. They were like, can we really say that those are written by those people? And so there are some books that the dust kind of takes time to settle on within the whole 27 canon, because these groups are debating and discussing, well, why do we have these ones and not other ones?
Right.
And the thing I want to stress on that is that this is why we need to understand our view of canon needs to be, and that very intro video was like 25 minutes in that playlist that was shared already by, I believe, who was it shared by? It was shared by, who was it shared by? Oh, yeah, Susie Q. She shared it. It's important to understand is that they did not make those books canon. They were already canon. What the church did was they recognized them. That's this. They didn't make them canon. They recognized, and I think that's an important distinction that we need to make. Very critical distinction. Okay.
And so there are various canon lists that come up throughout the ancient world where some people are hypothesizing, well, maybe, this book is part of it, or maybe this book is part of it. But it's this ongoing conversation of people. And by basically the end of the 2nd century, we have more or less unanimous agreement of the 27 books being those that encapsulate scripture that can be tied to either someone who knew Jesus or someone who knew someone who knew Jesus.
And so these books that were not included, are any of them interesting? I mean,
they're all interesting.
But does any of it seem like it belongs in the New Testament?
Well, so part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books. So you do have, and some of them have an agenda to them. So like the docetic Gospel of Peter seems to be uncomfortable with the fact that the biblical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have women being the first witnesses to the empty tomb. Because in the ancient world, women were not seen as good eyewitnesses.
Yeah, and that's kind of like, I forgot the scholar that said that. There's features in the Bible. I forgot the word. The phrase escapes me. That indicates exactly what he's talking about right here, right? You would expect maybe the exaltation of certain people or certain things. And then when you have like women being the first witnesses, eyewitnesses of the resurrection, it's like, wait a minute, what's going on here, right? And those types of details are things that we can't overlook, folks. But there's a term, and that term escapes me right now. There's an expression about what that actually is.
So you almost have this apologetic trying to solve that problem by having all the right people be witness to the resurrection. So you have all the Roman and Jewish officials camping out in front of the tomb, which also gives away the fact that like no Jewish priest on the eve of Passover is going to be camping out in front of a dead body. Like they didn't do that. So it betrays that the author of the Gospel of Peter has no understanding of purity ritual rites within 1st century Second Temple Judaism, but is also clearly trying to remedy this embarrassing fact.
All right, so we're at the end of the clip. We survived. We survived YouTube. YouTube, you tried and you failed, YouTube. Okay. No, but all of y'all help me get through this. I think this was a great clip. One thing I was going to mention. Yeah. So the thing is, the credibility issue with that book he's talking about is you have things that are uncharacteristic. That's the thing he was going to bring up there towards the end of that clip, where I cut off right there because we're going to try to bring this to a close. There may be opportunity to cover some other things, but there's so much here to cover. That the lack of credibility is that you have people doing things they wouldn't have done. So that means that whoever wrote this didn't even understand the customs and of that day, right? So like, and this is what you saw really in the conversation with Billy Carson and Wes. That some of that stuff came up in their conversation where you had people writing things that indicate their ignorance that then create suspicion about the validity of the document itself, right? Like I think in that conversation with Billy, it was about the sabbatical rules. Something about, was it something about, no, was it sabbatical? No, it was, yeah, it's connected to sabbatical. It's the, more specifically, the, you guys know what I'm talking about. Escapes me, right? It's been a long evening, ladies and gentlemen. 70, after 50 years, what's that period called? Jubilee. There it is. The Jubilee issue, right? So they didn't understand that. And so it's like, wait a minute, this person doesn't even understand Jubilee. How is this credible? I'm saying that in that conversation with Billy. So a similar thing was being brought up here in his conversation with Joe here. So with that being said, one thing I wanted to bring up, and I wanted to end with this point. Joe Rogan, and I didn't pause on this point, kept bringing up, man, these people with an oral culture, they're illiterate. No, he kept bringing it up, and I didn't pause. I probably should have paused on those instances. He kept saying, yeah, you have these people that are illiterate, and they have an oral tradition, and then he's like, well, there's these written books, these written documents. That just seems wild. And this gets back to the very last live I did. There seems to be confusion, folks. I want to just review some of the notes from that last live I did, and we'll just bring this to a close, okay? Yes, he did. He kept repeating that. That's right. I want to address that. This is important. I need to address this, okay? So he kept repeating that, and I want to address it from the very last live I did about the Canon, right? And so consider this. I gave you a definition for textuality. Remember that word, textuality? Remember, I'm going to type it in the chat. Textuality. We always come bearing gifts here on this channel, meaning we always come bearing words. Textuality. And so in a lot of circles, they seem to create a tug of war unnecessarily between textuality and orality. And so the idea of orality, you have this oral tradition, and textuality, let me give you a definition. Textuality means the knowledge, usage, and appreciation of text, regardless of individual or majority ability to create or access them via literate skills. So what you had in early Christianity, yes, by and large, the majority of the people in the Greco-Roman world were illiterate. That's just full stop. No denying that. But what you had in early Christianity is you had the oral tradition, but the oral tradition did not necessarily mean that there was no appreciation for the text. In fact, this was the very group of people that came with Old Testament included. You understand that? They came with Old Testament included. So they had an appreciation for the text. And remember, the text was read aloud. We can even think about even going back to the Old Testament. Think about Nehemiah. When you read the book of Nehemiah, the books were open and it was read in front of the people. So you had the oral tradition with both an appreciation of the text that was written. You understand? And so the takeaway, I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up. This should remind us that a culture can appreciate the value that of written text, even though it is largely illiterate. Orality, that means the oral tradition, and textuality, appreciation for the text, are not mutually exclusive. And so a lot of times when you hear people saying, oh, they got an oral tradition, I don't see how there would be these texts here. There's a lack of understanding. There's an embedded assumption about what it means to have an oral tradition. And so I wanted to bring that out. That's what we covered in our last live when we talked about New Testament canon. So I think it was important to bring that up. All right. Everyone, you've been great. You all have been great. Yep, you bore with me even with the challenges. We had a few challenges, but we got through it, all right? And so tomorrow we will have a live. We will be talking about Paul Wallace. So the Paul Wallace live was originally supposed to be today, but then, the interview with Joe Rogan and Wes, so we had to deal with that, right? So, but I moved that to tomorrow. So we're going to be talking about the so-called Bible scholar, Paul Wallace, who a lot of people have come to my channel and said, Rick, you need to interact with Paul Wallace because Billy Carson, he doesn't really know a whole lot about the Bible, but Paul Wallace really knows the Bible, so you need to check him out. So we will check him out tomorrow. So be here for that tomorrow, folks. Yeah, he said, the old trash theologian of Billy. Yes, that's a apropos description there. Yeah, be there tomorrow. Yes, thank you, Susie Q. Live, set your notifications. Appreciate the super chats. Thank you so very, very much. We're going to bring this live to a close. I think Wes did a fantastic job overall. Wonderful discussion. There was a lot more we could have covered, but I thought, a lot of that part of the conversation highlighted a lot of things we covered on this channel recently. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. It was a wonderful conversation. And just keep people like Joe Rogan in your prayers, right? There was a lot of information presented in that conversation they had. A lot of questions. There was a lot of things that were brought up. So just keep Joe Rogan in your prayers. Keep those who watched, who are currently unbelievers, in your prayers as well, okay? All right, so with that being said, we'll do this again, Lord willing, tomorrow. Remember, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God. Amen, amen, and God bless.